In the first phase of the conflict of Yugoslavia, it was about preventing violence. But once the military conflict had escalated between the rest of Yugoslavia and Slovenia, and then later on with Croatia, it was clear that, politically clear at least, that you could not keep Yugoslavia together as it had been in the past, as it existed in the past. Therefore, it was in the Assembly and in many other different forums the question of how you could prevent the military conflict to escalate further. But then, after the conflicts in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it became clear that even that was no longer possible. And then the debate was whether to engage in the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And I think that many in the Assembly discovered that if we would have acted earlier, we could have prevented a lot of the military escalation later on. But we, especially in Srebrenica, NATO reacted too late, in my view. And this was debated in the Assembly. Then, before the conflict escalated further into Kosovo, I was going with, as president, with a small delegation to Belgrade. And I discussed with the leadership at that time in Belgrade, the political leadership, and with the opposition, that it was an illusion that they could count upon that the European Union and NATO would split among traditional lines between Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, that we would stand together and that there was no chance for them to split this united NATO and this united Europe. And I offered them even at that time to get an associated membership status with NATO's Parliamentary Assembly if they would try to prevent violence and escalation and go in the direction of the West. They went the other way. We were not successful. And therefore, with the majority of NATO countries, we had to act militarily in the war in Kosovo. This was the next step in which my country, for the first time, intervened in such a way after World War II in a military conflict. After that war, the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO sent a delegation, and I was chairing that delegation, to Macedonia, where we again tried to prevent the next step of escalation of a conflict, possible conflict between Macedonia and Serbia proper. There we were successful. There we visited UN troops, blue helmets, who were there stationed there to prevent an escalation of the conflict. And the interesting point of that was that in this UN presence of blue helmets were American soldiers who stood under the command not of American officers, but of UN officers. And this was also a very interesting step in the development of Western institutions. The discussion in NATO Parliament about NATO enlargement started much, much earlier than in NATO itself. Actually, when I, together with some American Congress members, started a working group on NATO enlargement, and I became the general rapporteur of this working group, somebody asked at that time inside NATO, who has Carsten Vogt been given the right to establish such a group? And Simon Lunn, who was at that time General Secretary of the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, answered, that's how he told me, that you misinterpret Carsten Vogt if you would think that he is asking somebody in advance. Anyhow, we started this group on NATO enlargement. And at that time, the majority of the members inside the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly were still opposed to a NATO enlargement. And the majority of NATO countries were opposed. And the majority in the German government were opposed. And the majority at that time of the US Congress and of the US administration were opposed. So we started as a minority. But this minority composed a couple of members from the US Congress, some Democrats, some Republicans. It was assisted scientifically by some researchers, for example, especially from the RAND Corporation in Santa Monica. And it was supported directly by a minority in the German Social Democratic Party and a minority in the Christian Democratic Party, represented by, at that time, Defense Minister Volker Rühe. And step by step, we convinced more and more people inside the Assembly that one should support NATO enlargement. And then we sent out letters to all potential NATO members in East. But we also sent those letters to Russia and said, are you in favor, are you against? Is it really necessary to deploy nuclear weapons in those cases? Should one not combine the process of NATO enlargement with a closer cooperation with Russia? Should one not combine it with the process of disarmament? These were all questions which we asked in a long, long letter, and all the delegations sent the answers back a long time before those questions were asked by NATO itself. So I think this was a typical example where inside the NATO parliament, a discussion led to a change of opinions, and where step by step it assisted in the process in which NATO itself changed its view and became supportive of a process of NATO enlargement.